Under the dim glow of a dying lantern, the wind swept through the small wooden house on the edge of the desert, whistling through its cracks like a restless spirit. Outside, the land stretched wild and lonely. Red earth, thorny bushes, and the distant hum of coyotes calling under the moon. Inside, she sat trembling near the old bed, her breath shallow, her heart louder than the storm that gathered over the distant mountains. The night was heavy with the scent of rain and something deeper, fear, maybe, or the ache of something she didn't yet understand. She had seen men before, had heard their rough laughter from saloons and trading posts, but this one, the Apache, was not like them. His silence carried more weight than their words ever could. He had come into her life when the world had turned its back on her. Just a week ago, she was living quietly, mending clothes and tending her small garden near the creek. The townsfolk didn't say much to her since her father died last winter, leaving behind a small piece of land and an ocean of debts. They whispered, when she passed, calling her the lonely widow's daughter, though she had never known marriage or love. Then one evening she found him, wounded, half-conscious, lying beside the creek, his skin burning with fever, an arrow still lodged in his shoulder. The sun had been setting over the hills, and something inside her, something she couldn't explain, had made her drag his body into her cabin and tend to him through the long night. For 2 days he didn't speak a word. His dark eyes followed her movements, steady and unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, deep like the rumble of the earth before a storm. He said he was Apache. That word alone would have sent most villagers running, but she didn't. Maybe because she'd already been running from too many things, loneliness, judgment, the past. She couldn't bring herself to leave him. Something about his calm strength, the way he bore pain without a sound, made her forget her fear. But that calm now filled the room again, thick and uncertain, as he sat by the fire sharpening his knife, the flames dancing against his bronze skin. She watched him with a mix of curiosity and caution. The stories she had heard about his people weren't kind. They said the Apaches could vanish in shadows, hunt without rest, and take what they wanted by force. Yet here he was, a man of quiet discipline, his every movement deliberate, his gaze never lingering too long. He had thanked her for saving him, though the words sounded strange as if they didn't belong on his tongue. Since then, they'd lived in uneasy peace, the silence broken only by the crackle of fire and the whisper of the desert wind through the walls. But something had begun to shift between them, a tension neither could name. Earlier that day, she had gone into town for flour and medicine. The sheriff's wife had pulled her aside, warning her in a low voice, "You best not bring trouble to our doors. Folks say they've seen an Indian around your land. You know what that means." She had forced a smile, clutching her basket tighter, hiding the tremor in her hands. The way the townsfolk looked at her now, it was as if she was already guilty of something she didn't yet understand. When she returned home, the Apache was gone. Panic struck her chest until she found him hours later, standing by the creek, watching the setting sun. He didn't explain where he had gone. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to steady her heart again. Now, as the thunder rolled across the sky, she broke the silence. "You could have left," she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the room. "You're healed enough to go back." His eyes lifted, calm yet unreadable. "And leave you to the wolves," he said softly. There was no smile on his lips, but the firelight caught something warm in his gaze. It was strange, how he could sound both gentle and dangerous at the same time. She wanted to ask what he meant, but her tongue felt heavy. The rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, drumming on the roof like a warning. When lightning flashed, she caught a glimpse of his face, strong, scarred, but not cruel. His long black hair fell loose over his shoulders, beads of tribal jewelry glinting faintly in the light. He was different from anyone she'd ever known, and that difference frightened her more than anything else. Yet she couldn't look away. Maybe it was because he represented everything she'd been told to fear, and everything she secretly longed for. Something wild, something true, something that didn't belong to the narrow fences of her village life. She turned away, trying to steady her breathing, but his voice came again, quiet and certain. "You're afraid?" It wasn't a question. She hesitated before answering. "Shouldn't I be?" she murmured. "Everyone says you're kind." She stopped herself, ashamed of how small her words sounded. His eyes didn't harden as she expected. Instead, he rose from the chair and walked slowly toward her, the floor creaking under his steps. "My kind?" he repeated, his tone soft but edged with something that made her pulse quicken. "You speak as they do, but you looked at me different when I was bleeding." She swallowed hard. "That was different. You were hurt." He stopped. Inches away, the heat from the fire blending with the warmth of his body. "And now?" he asked. She could barely find her voice. "Now you're not." He studied her face in silence, his eyes tracing the fear she tried to hide. The storm outside grew louder, wind shaking the windows as the lantern flickered. He reached out, not to touch her, but to move a strand of hair that had fallen across her face. His fingers brushed the air near her cheek, close enough for her to feel the weight of his presence. Her breath caught in her throat. Every instinct told her to step back, yet she didn't. Maybe it was the loneliness. Maybe it was the way his voice sounded like the land itself. Steady, ancient, untamed. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "Does it hurt to love for the first time?" The words slipped from her lips before she even knew she'd said them. Her voice trembled, caught somewhere between fear and wonder. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. The rain, the thunder, the whispers of the village. All that remained was the silence between them. His gaze softened, and his reply came like a promise carried on the wind. "Easy," he murmured, his tone gentle but firm. "I'll be gentle." Her heart raced, not from danger but from something far deeper. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it, with the quiet assurance of a man who understood pain, who had learned to carry it without breaking. In that moment, she realized how much the world had lied to her. The people in town had spoken of savages, but the only cruelty she'd ever known had come from those who claimed to be civilized. He, the one they warned her against, was the only soul who had looked at her without judgment. Outside, the storm was breaking, the clouds splitting apart to reveal a slice of moonlight. But inside, the air was heavy with the weight of something neither could escape. The lantern flickered once more before dying, plunging the room into darkness. She could still feel his presence beside her, close enough to hear the steady rhythm of his breath. Somewhere beyond the sound of rain, a lone coyote howled. She knew that whatever line had once separated them, the world of the white woman and the world of the Apache, had begun to fade. The question was no longer whether she should fear him. It was whether she could stop herself from falling into something that might change her forever. And as the wind pressed against the windows and the fire dimmed to glowing embers, she realized that the night was far from over. The storm passed with the dawn, leaving the valley washed clean and still. Smoke drifted from the chimney as the woman stepped outside, her bare feet brushing against the damp wooden porch. The air smelled of rain and earth, sweet, heavy, alive. Across the field, the Apache stood at the edge of the creek, water running over his hands as he cleaned his blade. His back was straight, his movements calm, like the land itself had raised him. She watched him quietly, her fingers wrapped around the shawl at her shoulders, feeling something stir inside her that had nothing to do with fear anymore. The past few days had changed her world in ways she couldn't name. Before he arrived, her life had been a rhythm of silence. The same mornings, the same chores, the same stares from townsfolk who spoke more with their eyes than with words. They pitied her when her father died, but pity in that town was a slow kind of death. Folks helped only to remind you how much you owed them. Her father's debts had been taken over by a man named Claiborne, a rancher who had offered to buy her land for almost nothing. When she refused, he laughed, told her a woman had no business owning anything. Since then, she had learned to keep her head down and her doors locked. Then came that night, the night she found the Apache bleeding by the creek. She remembered the way the moonlight had fallen across his face, his chest rising shallow, his hand gripping a broken arrow. She didn't know what made her move toward him instead of away. Maybe it was the loneliness. Maybe it was because he looked less like a warrior then, and more like someone who'd been left to die. She had dragged him home, knowing what the town would say if they found out. To them, an Apache was the enemy, no matter what war had ended. But to her, in that moment he was just a man fighting to breathe. Inside she had spent hours at his side, wiping his forehead, whispering prayers she wasn't sure she still believed in. When his eyes finally opened, she had seen something in them she couldn't explain. Pain, yes, but also calm. As if he'd already made peace with whatever fate came for him. He never told her much about how he'd been hurt, only that soldiers had raided his camp near the river, and he had escaped. His words came slow and measured, each one carrying the weight of another world. Over time, she learned pieces of his story. He had once been part of a band that roamed the mountains, hunting, protecting their own. But when the army drove them into the reservation, he left, unwilling to live under orders from men who'd taken his people's land. Since then, he'd lived alone. Some called men like him outlaws, but he didn't look like one. He carried himself with quiet dignity, his scars speaking louder than any threat. Now, watching him by the water, she realized how strange it was that she trusted him more than anyone she knew. Yet the fear hadn't vanished completely. It lingered like a shadow in her mind, whispering of what might happen if the town discovered him. She had seen what they did to those they didn't understand. Last spring, a drifter accused of stealing cattle was hanged without a trial. The sheriff had called it justice. The Apache turned suddenly as if he'd felt her eyes. Their gazes met across the distance. He didn't speak, only nodded once before walking back toward the cabin. She busied herself with the kettle, though her hands trembled slightly. When he stepped inside, the room seemed smaller. His presence filled the space, steady, quiet, but powerful. "You were watching," he said simply. She tried to smile, "Just making sure you hadn't gone for good." He tilted his head, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "You want me to leave?" She hesitated. "I didn't say that." "Then you fear what they'll say." Her heart stuttered. "You don't know them." He stepped closer. "I know their kind. Men who speak with soft words and carry hate in their hearts." She didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. She had seen it her whole life, the way kindness in that town always came with a chain attached. For a moment, they stood in silence. Then he said quietly, "You saved me. I owe you." "You don't owe me anything," she whispered. He gave a faint smile. "In my way, I do. Life is not taken for free. A debt of blood must be paid," she frowned. "And how do you plan to pay it?" He didn't answer at first. Instead, he reached into the small pouch tied to his belt and placed something on the table. A small piece of carved bone shaped like a bird. It was worn smooth by time. "This belongs to my mother," he said. "She said it keeps the heart safe from evil. Now it belongs to you." She stared at the carving, unsure what to say. "I can't take this." "You already did," he said softly, his gaze fixed on hers. "You took it when you pulled me from the creek." Something in his tone made her throat tighten. She looked away, her eyes falling on the window where the morning sun spilled across the fields. Beyond those hills lay a world she'd never known, wild and untamed. The same world he came from. Later that day, she rode into town again. The streets were muddy from the rain, the church bell tolling somewhere beyond the square. As she tied her horse by the store, she could feel eyes on her, always the same sharp stares. Claiborne was there too, standing near the sheriff's office, chewing a straw and smirking when he saw her. "Morning," he drawled. "You been keeping busy out on that land of yours?" She forced a polite nod. "Just tending what's left of it." He leaned closer. "Heard some folks say they've seen tracks near your place. Bare feet. Not the kind we see around here." Her pulse quickened, but she kept her tone steady. "Maybe just a traveler passing through." Claiborne's grin widened. "Maybe, but you be careful. The sheriff don't like strangers." She left before he could say more, but the weight of his words followed her all the way home. That evening, when she told the Apache, his expression darkened. "They will come," he said simply. "Not yet, but soon." She looked at him, fear flickering in her chest. "What will you do if they find you here?" He met her eyes calmly. "If they come for me, they will not leave." The way he said it, quiet, certain, sent a chill down her spine. She wanted to tell him to go, to run before the town's hatred reached her door. But something stopped her. She couldn't bear the thought of the house without him now. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the sound of wind through the trees, thinking of everything that had brought them to this moment. The loneliness, the kindness, the danger now circling closer. She wondered what it meant to love someone the world told you to fear. In the darkness, she heard a sound outside, the crunch of boots on gravel. She sat up, her breath catching. The Apache was already awake, standing by the window with his knife drawn. Through the faint moonlight, she saw the shadow of a horse near the gate. He looked back at her, eyes sharp, every muscle ready. "It's Claiborne," she whispered. He nodded once, silent as stone. A knock rattled the door. "You in there, miss?" Claiborne's voice was low, oily. "Just checking to make sure you're safe." Folks been worried. Her heart pounded. The Apache motioned for her to stay quiet. Another knock came, harder this time. "You gonna open or make me break it down?" The Apache stepped closer to the door, knife glinting faintly, but she caught his arm. "Please," she whispered. "Not yet." Claiborne's boots scraped on the porch. "Strange tracks leading up this way. You got company, miss?" She swallowed, forcing her voice steady. "Just me. You can leave now." He laughed softly. "That so? Then you won't mind if I take a look." The door creaked, the latch straining under his hand. The Apache moved like a shadow, swift, silent, disappearing into the corner where the firelight didn't reach. The door opened a crack, and Claiborne's hat appeared in the gap, his eyes narrowing as he peered inside. For one suspended heartbeat, no one moved. Then his eyes flicked toward the shadows, where the outline of the Apache was barely visible. Claiborne's smirk vanished. The woman's voice broke the silence. "Leave, Claiborne. You're not welcome here." He hesitated, hand drifting toward the gun at his side. The Apache's knife caught the light, and something in that stillness, something dangerous and unspoken, made Claiborne step back. He spat into the dirt and muttered, "You'll regret this," before turning toward his horse. When the sound of hooves faded into the night, she finally let out the breath she'd been holding. The Apache didn't move, his eyes still on the door. "He will come back," he said. She nodded slowly. "I know." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint cry of a distant coyote. The peace between them was fragile, like the calm before another storm. But deep down, she knew something had already changed forever. Morning came slow and gray, the sky still heavy with the weight of what had happened the night before. She didn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the boards made her sit upright, expecting to see Claiborne's shadow at the door. The Apache hadn't rested either. When she finally stepped outside, he was already by the corral, tightening the rope on a horse that wasn't his. His movements were silent and deliberate, as if his body had learned long ago to prepare for danger before it arrived. He glanced at her, the morning light catching the sharp lines of his face. "He'll come with others," he said. "You should leave this place." She shook her head. "This is my home." He didn't argue, but the silence that followed carried more truth than words could. He knew what was coming, and deep down so did she. Claiborne wasn't the kind of man to let things rest. In this part of the country, the law often served the one with the loudest voice and the heaviest pocket. Claiborne had both. The day passed in uneasy quiet. She tried to keep busy, feeding the chickens, mending the fence, but her mind was far from her work. She could still hear Claiborne's threat echoing from the night before. "You'll regret this." It wasn't just about the Apache. It was about power, pride, and the cruel satisfaction men like him found in making others afraid. The Apache spent the morning walking the perimeter of the property. When he returned, he spoke in a tone that sent a chill through her. "They've been here already," he said. "3 men on horses. They rode to the ridge, then turned back. They'll come again." She met his eyes, her fear showing despite herself. "What will you do?" His jaw tightened slightly. "What I must." Later, as the sun dipped low over the hills, they sat by the fire. The quiet between them wasn't the same as before. It was thicker, heavier, filled with the weight of choices neither wanted to make. She broke it first. "You've lived with danger all your life," she said softly. "How do you stand it?" He looked into the flames for a long time before answering. "You don't stand it," he said finally. "You learn to move with it. Like water in the river, it never stops, it never breaks, but it changes everything it touches." His words lingered in her mind long after he went quiet. She realized she didn't really know him, not completely. She knew fragments, the scar on his shoulder, the way he watched the horizon like he was waiting for ghosts, but not the story that made him who he was. That night, when the wind picked up again, he told her a piece of it. "When I was a boy," he said quietly, "we lived near the White Mountains. My father taught me to hunt, to ride, to listen to the earth. When the soldiers came, they said we must live on their land, follow their rules. My father refused. They called him a rebel. One morning we woke to smoke and gunfire. My mother ran with me into the canyon. I remember her holding my face in her hands saying, "Be strong. The earth remembers those who endure." Then she pushed me behind the rocks. I never saw her again. She listened, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head. "Don't be. What is lost stays alive if you carry it right." Outside, a wolf howled in the distance long and low. She drew her shawl closer, but the chill she felt wasn't from the cold. For the first time, she understood the loneliness in him, not just the kind that comes from being alone, but from being unseen. The following morning, trouble arrived sooner than either expected. She was drawing water from the well when she saw the dust rising over the ridge. 4 riders. Even from a distance, she recognized Claiborne's brown hat and the sheriff's badge catching the light beside him. Her hands froze on the rope. The Apache appeared beside her within seconds. "Go inside," he said. "They'll kill you," she whispered. He didn't answer. He walked toward the barn, calm, every step measured. The riders came fast, the sound of hooves breaking the stillness of the morning. When they reached the yard, Claiborne dismounted, grinning like a man who thought the fight was already won. "Morning, miss," he said, tipping his hat. "Heard you had company again. We came to make sure everything's safe." She stood on the porch, her pulse hammering. "You have no right to be here." The sheriff shifted in his saddle. "We're just doing our duty, ma'am. Folks are worried. There have been cattle missing, fences cut. Some say they've seen an Apache around." Claiborne stepped closer, eyes sweeping the yard. "Mind if we look around?" Her voice trembled, but she held her ground. "I mind," he smiled. "Didn't think so." He pushed past her, motioning to the others. "Search the place." The Apache appeared from the barn doorway before they reached it, tall and still as a shadow. The men stopped, startled by how sudden he was. Claiborne's grin faltered. "Well, I'll be," he said slowly. "You really do have one here." He turned to the sheriff. "You see that? Told you she was harboring him." The sheriff's face hardened. "That man's wanted. Army says he killed 2 soldiers near the San Pedro Trail." "He was defending himself," she said quickly. "He was wounded." "I found him dying," Claiborne laughed. "You hear that, boys? She's got herself an outlaw hero." The Apache didn't speak. He just stood there, eyes fixed on Claiborne, knife resting loosely in his hand. Not threatening, but ready. The sheriff shifted nervously. "Put that down, son. No one's looking for trouble," Claiborne smirked. "I am." He drew his gun. It happened fast. The Apache moved like wind, one step forward, hand striking Claiborne's wrist. The gun clattered to the ground before Claiborne could fire. The other men raised their weapons, but the sheriff barked, "Enough!" For a tense moment, no one breathed. Then the sheriff exhaled, lowering his rifle. "Let's go," he muttered to Claiborne. "We'll settle this with the army." Claiborne retrieved his hat from the dirt, glaring at them both. "You think you can hide him forever?" he spat. "The next time I come, I won't be knocking." They rode off, leaving the yard torn and silent. The woman turned to the Apache, her voice shaking. "They'll bring soldiers. You can't stay now." He looked toward the hills. "I've been running all my life. Maybe it ends here." She stepped closer, her fear breaking into anger. "Don't say that. You saved me once already. I won't let them take you." He met her gaze, calm as always. "If they come, they won't take me. But they might take you." The words hit harder than she expected. She realized then how tangled their fates had become. Whatever line once separated them, white woman, Apache warrior, it no longer mattered. The world outside might never understand, but something bound them now, stronger than the fear that surrounded them. Days passed with no sign of the riders, but the air remained heavy, charged with waiting. Each sunrise brought the same quiet dread. Would this be the day soldiers appeared over the ridge? The Apache began preparing anyway. He reinforced the barn door, laid traps along the trail, gathered what supplies he could. She watched him work, torn between gratitude and despair. "You can't fight them all," she said once. He paused, looking at her. "I don't need to. Just long enough for you to get away." "I'm not leaving," she said. He stared at her for a long moment, something raw and unspoken passing between them. "Then you're a fool," he said softly. That night she dreamed of fire, of soldiers on horseback, of the cabin burning, of his voice calling her name from the smoke. She woke with tears on her face, the echo of his promise still in her ears. Easy. I'll be gentle. But even gentleness, she realized, could not stop the storm coming for them both. Outside, the horizon glowed red before dawn, like a warning written across the sky. And somewhere beyond those hills, men were already gathering. The days that followed were quiet in sound but full of unease. The land itself seemed to wait for what everyone knew was coming. The woman went about her chores, but her hands trembled when she touched the bucket, or when she looked toward the ridge where Claiborne had last been seen. The Apache had grown more watchful, his instincts sharp as the wind that moved through the grass at dusk. He didn't talk much anymore. His eyes were always searching the horizon, listening for something no one else could hear. Each morning before sunrise, he would ride out toward the foothills and return before noon, his horse covered in dust, his expression unreadable. Once, when she asked where he went, he said only, "To learn what hunts us." That answer was enough to keep her awake at night. The valley had never felt so empty, yet every shadow now seemed alive. The neighbors kept their distance. When she went to town for flour, conversation would stop as soon as she walked in. One woman whispered, "She's protecting him." Another said, "She's lost her mind." But the sheriff's eyes had changed most of all. He no longer looked at her with concern. Now he watched her with suspicion, like she carried a secret the law was waiting to uncover. By the third day, the tension had become unbearable. The Apache came in from scouting, his face dark with dust and worry. "They're not far," he said. "Soldiers, 10, maybe 12. They camp near the dry canyon." Her heart dropped. "How long before they reach us?" "Tomorrow," he said. At first light, she stood frozen for a long moment. "You should leave," she said finally, her voice trembling. "You can still make it to the mountains before they find you." He shook his head. "If I run, they will burn this place. They'll call you a traitor." "I don't care what they call me," she cried. "You'll die if you stay." He looked at her then, really looked, past the fear in her eyes, past the shaking in her voice. "You care," he said softly. "That's why you can't lie." That night, the wind blew hard across the valley, carrying the smell of smoke from the soldiers' campfires far to the south. The woman couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the dark outline of the hills while the Apache sat outside, sharpening his blade in silence. Every scrape of metal on stone sounded like the ticking of a clock counting down. When the moon broke through the clouds, she stepped out and sat beside him. "Tell me the truth," she whispered. "What happens when they come?" He paused, the knife still in his hand. "They will come to take me. If I go with them, they will hang me. If I fight, they will burn everything you own. Then what do we do?" His voice was calm. "We survive the morning." They sat together until the first faint light touched the horizon. He handed her his mother's carved bird again, pressing it into her palm. "If I fall, bury this by the creek. That's where I want to rest." She felt tears burn behind her eyes. "Don't talk like that." He stood, his shadow stretching across the dirt. "It's not death I fear," he said quietly. "It's leaving without finishing what the earth asked me to do." When dawn came, the stillness broke. Hooves thundered from beyond the ridge. The soldiers rode in a tight formation, the sheriff leading them with Claiborne beside him, his smug grin cutting through the dust. Behind them, the American flag fluttered stiffly in the morning wind. The woman stood on the porch, her breath short, watching as they approached. "Stay inside," the Apache told her, his voice steady. "Whatever happens, you do not come out." She wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes silenced her. He turned away and walked to the open yard, his knife sheathed, his hands empty. The soldiers stopped 30 paces away. The sheriff raised a hand. "That's far enough, son," he called. "You're surrounded." The Apache said nothing. Claiborne dismounted, spitting into the dirt. "Well, look at you!" "The ghost who wouldn't die." He turned toward the woman on the porch. "You sure picked yourself a fine one. You know, harboring a fugitive's a hanging offense." "She's done nothing wrong," the sheriff said, though his tone carried no real sympathy. "We just want the Indian." "Step aside, miss," the Apache's voice cut through the air. "She saved me. If you want someone to hang, take me." The sheriff shifted in his saddle, uneasy. "Orders are clear. You're to come with us." The Apache didn't move. "I don't belong to your orders." Claiborne's patience broke. "You'll belong to the dirt soon enough," he growled. He raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the Apache dove to the side, rolling behind the trough. The first shot cracked through the air, splintering wood inches from where he'd stood. The woman screamed from the porch, ducking as another shot shattered the window behind her. Chaos erupted. Horses reared, soldiers yelled. The Apache moved like shadow and flame, slipping between cover, his movements too fast to follow. He grabbed one fallen soldier's carbine and fired once, one clean shot that dropped a man from his horse. The sheriff shouted, "Hold your fire!" But the command came too late. Claiborne fired again, bullets tearing through the barn wall. The animals inside screamed and bolted. The air filled with dust, smoke, and the sharp smell of gunpowder. The woman crawled to the fallen rifle near the porch. She had never fired one before, but her father had taught her enough to know where the trigger was. She aimed toward the soldiers, her hands trembling. "Stop!" she shouted. "You'll kill us all!" No one heard her over the gunfire. The Apache had taken cover behind the well now, returning fire with calm precision. Each shot was measured, deliberate, but there were too many of them. He was fast, but he couldn't fight 12 armed men forever. Then she saw Claiborne moving along the side of the house, crouched low, his face twisted with hate. He was heading straight for the porch, her breath caught. She aimed the rifle but hesitated, her hands shaking too hard to line up the sight. He was already too close. Claiborne reached the steps, grabbing her arm and yanking her down. "You should have stayed quiet, girl," he hissed. "Now you'll die with him." Before he could raise his gun, the Apache was there. He moved with lightning speed, slamming into Claiborne and sending them both crashing into the dirt. The gun fired once, missing them both. They grappled, the sound of struggle harsh and desperate. The Apache's knife flashed, but Claiborne's hand clamped around his wrist, forcing it away. The woman stood frozen, unable to move, the rifle heavy in her hands. "Run!" the Apache shouted, his voice raw. She didn't. Instead, she lifted the gun again. The scene blurred in her eyes. Dust, sweat, blood, and the sound of the world collapsing around them. Then came the loudest crack yet. A soldier's rifle. The bullet struck the porch post, showering her in splinters. The Apache turned his head for half a second, just long enough for Claiborne to grab a rock and strike him across the jaw. He fell to one knee. Claiborne reached for his pistol again, fury twisting his face. The woman screamed and pulled the trigger. The gun kicked against her shoulder. Claiborne stumbled back, his eyes wide with disbelief before collapsing beside the steps. For a long moment, everything stopped. The soldiers, the wind, even the sound of the creek in the distance. Then the sheriff shouted, "Hold your fire! Everyone stand down!" The woman dropped the rifle, her body shaking. The Apache staggered to his feet, blood at the corner of his mouth, his gaze fixed on her. Neither spoke. Behind them, the soldiers hesitated, uncertain whether the fight was over or just beginning. The sheriff dismounted slowly, his hand still on his holster. "You've done it now," he said to the woman, voice low and grim. "You've killed a man of this town." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "He would have killed us both." The sheriff's eyes flicked to the Apache, then back to her. "Maybe, but the law won't see it that way." The Apache took a step forward, placing himself between her and the soldiers. "Then they'll have to go through me." The soldiers tensed again, fingers on their triggers. The air seemed to hold its breath. The woman could feel the weight of every decision pressing down, the truth that there was no turning back. In that single instant, the peaceful world she once knew was gone. All that remained was the sound of the wind moving through the valley, and the echo of fate waiting to fall. And as the sheriff raised his hand to give the order, the Apache turned his head slightly toward her, his eyes steady and calm despite the chaos around them. "When it comes," he said softly, "don't look away." Then the world erupted once more in the roar of gunfire. The air exploded with the thunder of rifles. The echo rolled through the valley, scattering the birds and leaving behind a haze of smoke and dust that hung heavy in the morning light. The woman dropped to her knees, covering her ears, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. The Apache dove for cover, returning fire with the last of his ammunition. Bullets tore through the wooden posts, splinters flying like sharp rain. The sheriff shouted for his men to hold, but the soldiers were caught in chaos. Some firing blindly, others backing their horses away from the mess they had helped create. Then came a sudden stillness. The smoke cleared, revealing what was left. Claiborne lay motionless where he had fallen, his gun beside him, blood staining the dirt dark. The sheriff stood frozen, the weight of what had happened written all over his face. Several soldiers had dismounted, weapons still drawn but uncertain. The Apache stood in the center of it all, breathing hard, his face streaked with sweat and dust, his eyes still fierce but calm. The fight was over, but the silence that followed was even louder than the gunfire. The woman rose slowly from the porch, her body trembling. She looked around at the ruin of her home, the shattered windows, the smoking boards, the broken fence where her father's old mare had bolted in fear. It didn't look like the same place anymore. It didn't feel like home. She turned toward the Apache, and for the first time, she saw the wound in his side. A crimson patch spread across his shirt, darker with each breath he took. She ran to him, catching him before he fell. "You're hurt," she whispered. "It's nothing," he said quietly, though his voice was weaker now. She pressed her hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "You saved me. You saved us both." He looked at her through half-lidded eyes, a faint smile on his lips. "You saved me first." The sheriff approached slowly, gun lowered but his expression uncertain. "You two need to come with me," he said. "There's going to be questions about what happened here." The woman shook her head. "You saw what happened. Claiborne fired first." The sheriff sighed, wiping sweat from his brow. "Doesn't matter what I saw. The army will want answers. A white man's dead, and there's no easy way to explain that to the folks in town." Her heart clenched. "So you'll just hand him over?" The sheriff didn't answer right away. He looked around at the soldiers, then at the Apache, then back at her. "You've got until sunset," he said finally. "Then I'll be back with the marshal. I can't give you more than that." She stared at him in disbelief. "You're giving us a head start?" He adjusted his hat and turned away. "Let's just say I've seen enough men die for pride. Do what you need to do." When the last of the soldiers rode away, she knelt beside the Apache again. "We have to go," she said. He shook his head. "You can. I can't ride like this." She refused to listen. "You told me not to be afraid. You told me to move with the storm. So now you'll do the same." He gave a small, tired laugh. "You've learned too much from me." She helped him onto the horse, her arms trembling under his weight. The saddle creaked as he leaned forward, gripping the reins. The two of them rode north toward the mountains, where the land turned wild and the law's reach grew thin. The trail was hard, and his strength faded with each mile, but he didn't complain. The woman kept talking, sometimes softly, sometimes just to keep him awake. She told him about the river near her father's land, about the sound of the church bells she used to hate as a child, about how she used to dream of leaving this valley one day but never had the courage. They stopped by the creek when the sun began to fall. The light turned the water gold, and the desert stretched endless around them. He slipped from the saddle and sank to the ground, leaning against a rock. His breathing was slow now, shallow but steady. "Rest," she said, kneeling beside him. "I'll find water." He caught her wrist gently. "Stay," he said. "You've done enough." She sat beside him, holding his hand as the wind stirred through the tall grass. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence was peaceful in a way she hadn't felt in years, like the world had stopped spinning just for a moment, to let them breathe. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "Do you remember what you asked me that night?" She looked at him, confused at first, then realized, "Does it hurt to love for the first time?" His lips curved faintly. "Yes, but it's worth the pain." Tears filled her eyes. She wanted to tell him not to talk like that, not to make it sound like goodbye. But his gaze held hers, calm and steady, as if he already knew she'd understand. He lifted his hand weakly, brushing her cheek with his thumb. "The land will remember us," he said softly. "You must too." She pressed her forehead against his, feeling the warmth of his breath against her skin. "I will," she whispered. The sky darkened, stars beginning to pierce the fading light. The creek murmured beside them, and the world grew still again. Hours later, she buried him by the water, beneath the same cottonwood tree where she had first found him. She laid the small carved bird on his chest and covered it with earth, whispering a prayer her father had once taught her, though she changed the words to fit the man she'd come to love. When she finished, she sat there in the moonlight, staring at the mound of fresh soil and the endless stretch of night beyond it. The sheriff's words echoed in her mind. "You've got until sunset." She didn't know what would happen next, whether she'd be hunted, jailed, or simply forgotten. But she knew one thing. She couldn't go back to that town. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. At dawn, she packed what little she had left and rode west, following the same trail he once told her led toward his people's old hunting grounds. The journey was long and lonely, but the air smelled cleaner out there, and the fear that had once ruled her heart slowly faded into something else, something stronger. Weeks passed before she reached the edge of the mountains. There, among the red cliffs and the wind-carved stones, she built a small shelter and started again. She planted corn by the creek, fetched water each morning, and watched the stars each night. Sometimes she'd speak aloud as if he were still sitting beside her, and tell him what she saw, what she built, what she dreamed. The silence no longer frightened her. It felt like home now. The locals in the nearest settlement began to whisper about a woman who lived alone by the canyon, the one who kept an Apache carving on her windowsill and spoke to the wind as if it carried someone's voice. Some said she was cursed, others said she was blessed, but none dared disturb her peace. Years later, travelers passing through the valley often stopped by the old creek and saw a small grave under the cottonwood tree. A wooden bird worn smooth by rain and sun still rested there. They never knew the story behind it, but they said the place felt sacred, as if two hearts had once found something there that the world couldn't break. As for her, she grew older, her hair silvering under the desert sun, her hands still strong from the life she built on her own. Every year, on the same night she first met him, she lit a small fire by the creek and watched the flames dance until dawn. She never remarried, never returned to the town that had turned its back on her. Sometimes, when the wind rose across the canyon, it carried a whisper that made her close her eyes and smile. Soft, deep and familiar, easy, it seemed to say. "I'll be gentle," and she would whisper back to the open sky, "It doesn't hurt anymore." The land stayed quiet then, the creek flowing like a memory that never faded, and the stars watched over them both, the woman who had dared to love and the man who had taught her how.